Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. When Todd first called and said that the theme was community, I started looking for the ways that community is used. And they're used a lot of different ways. Online community, business community, white community, black community, tech community. I even crowdsourced this question to my little cadre of social media followers, and I got all kinds of responses where people felt community. Festivals, football games, funerals, churches. And of course, it might not surprise you that if you look at this, it doesn't really have much of a meaning. It doesn't really tell us what we should be doing if we're trying to build a community. When I think about community, I think about Martin Luther King Jr. And I think about the notion that he put forward of a beloved community. He said, our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls and a quantitative change in our lives. You see, the community that King envisioned is all-inclusive. Everybody's a part of it. It can't be exclusionary if it's beloved. Second, if it includes everyone, the differences of its members have to actually be embraced, the beloved part of the community. And then King talked a lot about, when he talked about beloved community, the fact that we all had to work for justice. And not only the justice of ourselves, but we had to work for the justice of every member of the beloved community. Now that is a pretty tall task, but I think it's a necessary one. And King thought it was a necessary one because what he said was that in an interconnected world, the only way we would develop the empathy required to actually solve our problems across our differences was by building the beloved community. So that's the challenge. How do we build the beloved community? Well, what if building the beloved community actually meant us taking one phrase and applying it to ourselves and to our actions? A phrase we've all heard many times. Love thy neighbor. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Love thy neighbor? You don't know my neighbor. Or, like my wife and I, our walls were so thin, we knew our neighbor far too well. But I don't want us to think about a specific person when we think about love our neighbor. I think we want to look at the root of the word. It actually has two roots, ne, near, and bor, home base, or someone's heart to a certain extent. So if we take this notion of neighbor, instead of thinking about the people who live near us, I want us to turn it around and think about the people who we live near, that we actually start to be a neighbor by living near someone else's home. So in other words, how do you love someone's home base? Well, you can visit their home base, you can visit their community, and I'm sure many of us have. If I went to your home, I'm sure I'd see travel photos, and I'd see mementos, maybe artwork from other places, maybe other foods that you consume at home. But those visits are only visits. They are not the deep kind of engagement that we need when we think about beloved community, because if we're going to take this notion seriously, we have to confront a very tough truth. We cannot consume our way to community. One click, one more friend, one more trip is not actually going to build the beloved community. Instead, we need an engagement, an ongoing engagement with other communities and on their home turfs. There was a visit that I made when I was in college. Imagine a Sunday, sticky Sunday in September. I'm on the MARTA bus going down to Old Ebenezer Baptist Church, King's home church on Auburn Avenue. And I go into the church. It was still in the original sanctuary then, and it was a sight. The original pulpit where King preached, the robes of the choir, the long pews, the women wearing their Sunday hats that you always see in an African-American church. And I sat down, and the service started, and we opened up our hymnal to the first song of the day, and I was shocked to discover that the same song that was first that day on Ebenezer Baptist docket was a song that we used to sing in my all-white country church in rural Arkansas. The second song, same one. Third song, same one. I knew all the songs. Now, I didn't sing them as well or as fast as Ebenezer Baptist, but I knew them. And so I jumped right in and I sang them, and this caused a bit of a stir among my seatmates left and right, who I did not know, both African American folks. They were curious why this 18-year-old kid knew all of these spirituals. So we started talking about it. We started talking about church. We started talking about family. We started talking about home. I went back the next Sunday, and then I went back again. And those visits turned into an engagement, which then turned into an academic pursuit, that then turned into a professional pursuit. And for me, a lifetime of understanding and studying and engaging Southern African American history and communities. That's more than a visit. That's actually being a neighbor. It's not only that we build community by being the neighbor, but I would argue that being a neighbor is the ultimate expression of love. And the reason is because if we truly love our neighbor, that connection can transform people, and it can actually reconcile the fiercest of enemies. If you look at the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, all the leaders at some point said something along the following lines. We weren't just fighting for African American freedom, we were trying to liberate the oppressors from their mindset. And we were trying to liberate America from the plight of segregation. And no one embodied this more than someone that I've gotten to know, Reverend C.T. Vivian. Reverend C.T. Vivian is a true American hero. He was one of the people who sat in Nashville. He was drug out of restaurants, spit upon. He was one of the Freedom Riders, where he was beaten in Alabama and Mississippi. He was on the bridge in Selma on Bloody Sunday. This is a picture of C.T. praying for Sheriff Jim Clark, who was the feared and some would say murderous sheriff of Selma. And I asked Reverend Vivian one day, I said, what were you thinking when you walked up every day and prayed for Sheriff Clark? And he said, I'd pray in the morning and I'd go to Sheriff Clark and he would yell at me. And the next day I'd pray and then I'd go and he'd arrest me. And one day he even broke his hand across my jaw when he punched me. And the next day I prayed again because I truly believed that the next day was the day we were going to be reconciled and that he was going to see the evil of his ways. That is stunning. And it is what we see in so many different contexts. Whether you look at Gandhi and the way he thought about the British, you look at Mandela and Tutu and the way they thought about the Afrikaners, they believed that they weren't just freeing themselves, but they were building a whole new society, and they were going to reconcile with their neighbors who they were living near. And they were right. Each of those societies were changed because of the practice of loving thy neighbor. Now, these people have risen to the world of almost being saintly. And so it begs the question, how do we actually build our own capacity to be a neighbor, to practice this notion of loving our neighbors? Well, I believe that actually it is a combination of a mindset, the notion of beloved community, the notion of loving thy neighbor, living near their home base, and a certain skill set, that there actually are a few attributes that you can develop over time. And I'd like to just take a minute to kind of run through them. First one of these, and probably most important, is a true respect for otherness. If you're going to actually venture out and visit someone's home base and be the only person who is different who's there, you have to actually truly respect the otherness. I've done a lot of cross-community work, and I've often been the only other in the room, the only white person, the only male, the only Southerner, the only whatever. And I used to, when I first started this, I used to try to fit in. So, maybe I'd dress a certain way, or maybe I'd change my accent a little bit, or maybe I'd try to find an artist that I thought somebody would like, and I would make these false connections. But that was the ultimate disrespect of the people I was visiting. I had to maintain my authenticity to show the actual respect of the other. And that's the basis that we have to enter communities. We have to maintain ourselves so that we actually can, when we ask a question, we can actually be asking it in truth. The second is, as we venture out, we don't have the ability to listen in the regular way. Maybe we speak the language, but we don't know the shorthand. We don't know the cultural markers. We don't know the landscape. And so we have to develop the ability to listen with our hearts. A friend of mine who's a social worker tells a story that among grief counselors, it's well known that grief is often expressed in one's native tongue. No matter how long they've lived in another country, whatever they first grew up with is the tongue and the language that they express true grief with. And the best grief counselors don't ask them to translate. They simply listen emotionally. They listen with their hearts in order to see what that person is feeling and see what they need. We have to cultivate the same sense. We have to listen with our hearts so that we can actually engage people who are very different from us and situations that are very different from us. The third is we have to have authenticity but flexibility of behavior. I lived in India for a while, and one of my projects, I was a consultant, I had a team, and it was all Indians, and the client was all Indians. And we had a kickoff lunch to start the project. It was a nice buffet spread of Indian food. There was the food, there were the plates, there were the napkins, there were the peppers, there were the spices, there was the bread. There was no silverware. So I sort of paused a minute, looked around the room to see how this was happening, and I noticed that people were setting up their plate a certain way. They were using the bread to basically dip the food and eat with their hands. So I did the same thing. I set my plate up the same way. I went and sat down. I started eating with my hands. Didn't say anything, no drama, nothing. 6 months later, one of the team members from the client came up to me. He said, we were very worried about you when this project started. I said, oh, really? Why? He said, because we didn't think you were going to be able to connect with us, being an American and everybody else on the team being Indian. And he said, something happened and changed our mind. I said, what was it? He said, the first day you ate with your hands and you didn't say anything about it. You didn't make a big deal out of it. That ability to take a little bit of information and apply it in real time, to have a little bit of flexibility of behavior, can build enormous connection with someone else, especially when you're new to a community. Another is that you have to have a tolerance for ambiguity. Now, rounded to the nearest 1,000, how many times do you think that I've been asked, what is a white guy doing running the Center for Civil and Human Rights? It's in the tens of thousands now. And when I first started with the job, a lot of times I would react a bit defensively. I would say, well, where's this person coming from? But very quickly I noticed that 99% of the time that question was actually asked from the very least curiosity, and most often it was a positive. So I would simply answer it, and then it would open a conversation. Someone would say, here's my connection to the topic, here's my family story, here's what I think you should be doing. And it became a positive exchange. If we're open to the ambiguity that exists when we first enter another community, it will often open up a very intimate conversation quickly. But if we're defensive, if we shut it down, if we try to make it about us, we'll miss that opportunity. The final one that we have to cultivate is one that's very hard to do, and that's overcoming the fear of accidental offense. Now, let me just try to do my best and say, I absolve you of all guilt of accidental offense starting today. Because if you're going to venture out, if you're going to actually practice being a neighbor to different communities, you're going to accidentally offend. My favorite story comes from my own family. My wife's family is originally from India. My family is originally from Oklahoma. And before we were married, my father and I visited my fiancé then's parents' house without my fiancé. We arrived, we had pleasantries, we drank tea, and then my father and I went to take our bags upstairs where we were going to sleep. My father grabbed his bag because he likes to show that he's still pretty spry as an older guy and carried it up the stairs, and I grabbed mine and carried it up the stairs. This caused a very fluxumed phone call from my mother-in-law-to-be to my fiancé. And she said, what is Doug doing disrespecting his father? And my wife said, what do you mean? And she said, he didn't carry his father's bag up the stairs. Doesn't he know that that's what we do? Well, this opened up a very interesting and ultimately an amazing conversation about the differences in elders, respect, culture across our burgeoning family. Sometimes we have to venture out. We will accidentally offend, but if we're open to it, we will make the connections and we will overcome that very quickly. You know, when I think about this notion of a neighbor, something happened very early on that makes this whole topic extremely personal to me. I said earlier that I was from a rural town in Arkansas. It was 1,200 people when I grew up there. It's now a thriving metropolis of 2,000 people. I mean, it's just grown exponentially. And when I grew up there, we used to have a joke that there were two minority families in town, the two Catholic families. Because there was no racial, ethnic, religious diversity really of any kind in my little town in Arkansas. And so in one ways, it was an idyllic community. But in another way, it was not the beloved community because it wasn't all inclusive. It didn't allow everybody to be a part of it. So that's where I was from, and being from there, I also was a huge fan of Arkansas college football, as almost anyone is there, the Roaring Razorbacks. And when my brother went to college there, he was older than I was, he befriended one of the football cheerleaders, a guy who lived on his hall, and he called up, he said, if you come to the football game, Arthur will be able to get you on the football field. Well, this was the greatest news that I had heard in my 5 years of life, that I would be able to get onto the football field. So we go to the University of Arkansas, and I meet Arthur, and he takes me on the football field, and he is an incredible guy. He is kind. He is one of those people who connects with kids. He explains to me everything about football. This is a picture of that meeting. I'm on the left. Arthur was my hero. He was the greatest guy I'd ever met. So I convinced my parents and my brother to bring Arthur home to my little town to visit us. Well, the return trip didn't go as well. When Arthur moved around the community, things were said, people were a bit hostile. It was not a great reception. And Arthur's response to it was the same he had had to me. He was kind, he was loving, he was accepting, he was empathetic. He visited our home base in a way that was giving, even though people didn't want him to be there. And that moment set me on a path to do my very best to try to build that empathy within myself for various communities. It inspired me then, it continues to inspire me now. And it's something that I think is epitomized by a quote from someone who, of course, knows a lot about being a neighbor, Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers said, "Love isn't a state of perfect caring. It's an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is right here and now." That's exactly what Arthur did. When he visited our home, he accepted everyone he encountered, good, bad, or indifferent, exactly who they were right then and right there. This notion of love thy neighbor is something that, for me, transformed me very early in life. It's something that, as I have studied the American Civil Rights Movement and other social movements, it shows itself to have a transformative power on society and is the only way that enemies can be reconciled. And as we look across our community, as we look across our world, the problems strike me as being communal in nature. Whether it be the environment or economics and poverty or freedom and human rights, they're all communal. And I believe today that the only way we can build the capacity individually and collectively to address our communal problems is by pursuing the beloved community, by loving our neighbors. I hope that we'll get started today. Thanks.